Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 523 for the 8th of Iyar in a regular year. And today we're going to be discussing a really interesting scene in the Bible, a scene which sounds really risque when you hear about it at first glance and might bring up a lot of questions, namely the scene where Yaakov, our forefather Jacob, meets Rochel for the first time. And what does he do? He kisses her. And if that's not weird enough to kiss a girl immediately upon meeting her before saying hello or anything like that, what does he do right after kissing her? The Torah tells us that he lifts up his voice and then he begins to cry. So what is going on? What is this all about? Like, who does that? What kind of man, upon meeting a woman, before introducing himself, before finding out about her, just saying hello or anything like that, grabs her, kisses her, and then raises up his voice, like calls up to screams out, and then starts crying. Just picture this scene. If we saw something like this happen in our modern day world, issues of modesty aside, which is its own question, right? Is like, how is this a modest thing to do, to go and kiss a woman upon meeting her initially, and then follow up this kiss with a cry out to the heavens or something like that, and then start crying? If we saw something like this happen in our modern day society, most likely we might call some security authorities, right? Or we might think that this person had some severe issues or something like that. But we know that there must be something deeper to the story, because we know that Yaakov Avinu, not only was he a very sane person, but he was actually an extremely holy man. He was one of the forefathers. So obviously, when we see these stories in the Torah, we have to understand that there's something deeper going on. And that's exactly what it is that we're going to be unlocking today, is what is the deeper meaning? What was actually going on in this story? And so today we're actually going to be learning that there actually is a deeper meaning, deeper kind of spiritual intent behind all this very interesting story, in the sense that each one of our forefathers and our foremothers, I should mention, so Rochel falls into this category as well, serve as archetypes for different types of attributes. And their souls were very lofty in the sense that they stemmed really from these supernal archetypes, these supernal energies on high that really come ultimately from this highest world of Atzilus, which, as we've already learned, is the highest of all spiritual worlds. So when we look at the story within that context, within the context of these spiritual energies, we actually can understand it in a much, much deeper way. And we can understand that, what does, in speaking of archetypes, what does Yaakov represent and what does Rochel represent? So Yaakov, as we've already began to discuss yesterday, represents the emotive expression of compassion, which, as we discussed, stems from the attribute, the spiritual attribute of harmony, of Tiferes, the merging of the two energies of Chesed and Gvura. Now, what about Rochel? Because after all, in this story, Yaakov kisses Rochel, and Rochel was one of our foremothers. So Rochel in Kabbalah is associated with the attribute of Malchus. Now, Malchus is a really interesting attribute. Malchus is translated to mean sovereignty, kingship, royalty, something like that. And what's interesting about Malchus is that although it's the seventh of the seven emotive attributes, it doesn't really have its own definition of its own, the way that the other six do, but rather what it does is it kind of collects and is made up of the six emotive attributes prior to it. So there's a lot that could be said about this attribute of Malchus. Malchus is associated with Shabbos. So it's like we can think of how there's the 6 days of the week, and then there's the seventh day of Shabbos, which kind of the result of the 6 days of the week. Like, whereas the 6 days of the week are all about expression and action, the seventh day Shabbos is all about the beingness, the, just the, what the essentialness of these 6 attributes, like on the deeper level of the inner dimension of it all. So this is what Malchus is. And another way to think about Malchus, something that Malchus is associated with in terms of the Jewish people, is that it's what's called Knesset Yisrael, congregation of Israel, which is an expression that symbolizes the collectivity of all Jewish souls. That's what's called Knesset Yisrael on a spiritual level. It's like where all Jewish souls are really combined into one, is this Knesset Yisrael. So when we look at this story from this Kabbalistic, more spiritual vantage point, then we actually, every time it says Yaakov, every time it says Rochel, we're thinking of these things in terms of archetypes, of these spiritual archetypes. So now we can read the story in a very different way. So when the text tells us that Yaakov kissed Rochel, so now we know that Yaakov is the attribute of compassion. And so we say compassion kissed the congregation of Israel, meaning that it kind of connected, compassion connected with the congregation of Israel, with the source of all Jewish souls. And then Yaakov called out to the heavens. So he kind of, lifted this attribute of compassion up and above Knesset Yisrael itself, up and above the source of the Jewish souls themselves, to something higher, to kind of like the source of it all, namely within God. And then he cried. So what's crying? So what crying is an expression of, tears flow downwards. It's an outpouring of downward flow down below. So meaning that Yaakov, or in other words, the attribute of compassion, made a connection with a very deep connection, the connection of a kiss, with Rochel, with the attribute of the congregation of Israel, the source of the souls of Jewish people. After forming that connection, Yaakov rose up to a level that's even higher, to his source in the attribute of compassion above, and then drew down that attribute of compassion down into the collective soul of the Jewish people. Why does the collective soul of the Jewish people need compassion? Because as we've already explained at length previously, that our souls are down here in this world in a way of exile. We don't belong here. Our godly souls feel very uncomfortable in this physical world. So the way that we can be redeemed from this exile is through arousing this attribute of compassion within ourselves. And this arouses the attribute of compassion from God. And that translates into us being redeemed to a certain extent from this exile. And so, this might sound like really lofty and like kind of out there ideas when we think about Yaakov and Rochel and all that stuff. But as we'll see, the Alter Rebbe actually brings it down, and he explains to us how we too can connect to God on this level and kind of like reenact the story of Yaakov and Rochel through the performance of God's mitzvahs and keeping God's Torah. Because every time, as we'll see, when we utilize our three garments of our soul, thought, speech, and action, to serve God, we can think of these as being ways of kissing God, because when a person kisses, it's with their mouth, right? So like a kiss on the mouth, like a mouth to mouth, that's like when we speak words of Torah, it's basically as if we're kissing God. We're forming that connection in the same way that Yaakov formed that connection with Rochel. When we use our mind to connect with God, to learn the words of Torah, we're connecting our mind to God's mind, and it's a very intimate kind of connection, an intimate bond. And then on a physical level, when we actually do God's mitzvahs, then we connect with God and we bond with God in a very, very physical way. And as we'll see, the Alter Rebbe says, while this is true of all mitzvahs, there's a special place for this when it comes to tzedakah, when we do the mitzvah of tzedakah, because that's like God's, tzedakah is like kind of like the epitome of all the mitzvahs, because tzedakah, giving charity, is associated with chesed, with the attribute of chesed, which is that first primordial emotive attribute, which is like sort of like where all the other emotive attributes come from. It's like God's quintessential emotive attribute. So when we do tzedakah, we're connecting with God on this very physical level. Our physicality is connecting with God by way of, the way that it's described is by virtue of like, it's like a hug. It's like God is hugging us. Like it says that he hugged me with his right side, because the right side is associated with this attribute of chesed. So with all of this being said, I know this is a long introduction here. Let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe goes through all of this in a step-by-step way. And for context, we're in the middle of chapter 45 today of Likkutei Amarim, and we're actually going to complete chapter 45 today. So beginning with this verse about Yaakov kissing Rochel, in Hebrew it's Vayishak Yaakov Rochel, which comes from Bereshis chapter 29, verse 11. And while the Alter Rebbe only quotes the first part there, I'll read you the full pasuk for context. It says, "V'yishak Yaakov leRachel v'yisa et kolo v'yivek." So a few things happened here. So, and Yaakov kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. So we're going to break down what each one of these things mean. What is Yaakov? What is Rachel? What is this lifting up of his voice? And what is the weeping all about? So the Alter Rebbe explains that, first of all, Rachel. Let's start with Rachel. So Rachel, as is spoken about in numerous places in Jewish literature, is really representative of the Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel. What is the Knesset Yisrael? This is the source of all Jewish souls. And Yaakov, on the other hand, in his supernal attribute above, is the attribute of rachamim, of compassion, that is found in Atzilus. So Atzilus is the highest of all realms, and this is the source of where Yaakov comes from. This is like the representation of Yaakov above. And so Yaakov is the one that has this ability to be able to arouse mercy for the Knesset Yisrael, for the collectivity of the Jewish people. So this is why they make like a really good pair, because there's Yaakov, which is mercy, and then Rachel, which is the collectivity of the Jewish people. So Yaakov arouses mercy for the Jewish people. Okay, so now that's why we have Yaakov and Rachel. Now, what's this deal with Yaakov raising up his voice? So he raised his voice. It's like this imagery of lifting upwards. So it was like Yaakov was basically going upwards, elevating himself to his source in these higher compassions, like in this level of the supernal compassion, in this level of Atzilus, which is called, what is it there? What is this attribute of mercy called there? It's called Av HaRachamim. This is the father of mercies, and this is the source of all mercy. So it's like really getting to the root source of the mercies. And then what did he do after looking up or rather calling up? Then he cried. So he wept. Why did he cry? What was that about? And so the crying was in order to awaken and in order to draw down from these supernal mercies, from these very, very high up lofty mercies, and to draw it down into all of the souls of the Jewish people, of the collectivity of the souls of Israel, in order to raise them up out of their exile and in order to unify them with true unity, with real unity with God, in a way of a kiss. So it's like, if you think about again, so now we go back to a kiss. What is a kiss? A kiss is unity. You're uniting mouth to mouth. So this is the idea of a kiss is not only when you kiss is the lips touching, but there's an exchange of breath that happens. So there's a unity of a connecting of spirit to spirit, as it says. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings a verse from Shir HaShirim, which is there's a lot of imagery that's very pertinent to these ideas in Shir HaShirim. This is the verse right at the beginning. This is from chapter 1, verse 2, which says, Yeshkeni v'neshikot pihu. So let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. So there's this imagery involved regarding God that has to do with kissing. So what does this mean? How do we kiss God? When do we kiss God? So this is the idea of whenever we speak, when we talk about halacha, for example, and talk about godly ideas, then this is where we are connecting our speech with God's speech, because God's speech is halacha. So we're connecting our speech to God's speech. So that's a type of kiss, that we're kissing God. And so too, if we connect our thoughts to God's thoughts. So if we think about Torah, the same thing happens. And so too when it comes to action. So again, remember, we have these three garments of the soul. There's thought, speech, and action. So we talked about speech, we talked about thought. Now we're going to talk about action, that when we actually do the mitzvahs, then, and especially the mitzvah of tzedakah and mitzvahs involving loving kindness and giving, these have to do with us being able to connect our action with God's action, because we know that there's this principle that and this comes from Tikkunei Zohar, where it says that chesed is the right arm. So it's like chesed is connected to the right side, and chesed, when Hashem does chesed to us, this is as if he's actually hugging us. And this is illustrated again in Shir HaShirim in chapter 2, verse 6, where it says, V'yamino techakbeni, so that it says that his right arm embraced me, his right arm hugged me. So there's something about that right arm that has to do with hugging. And so when we are involved with learning Torah, so just to recap, this is what the Alter Rebbe is doing now, is when we involve ourselves in Torah, when it comes to our speech or when it comes to our thoughts, when we really meditate and think about God, and we really talk about God and Torah and all those things, then this is like we're kissing God, because we're connecting our speech and we're connecting our thoughts with God. And so too, when we involve ourselves with God's mitzvahs, when we actually perform God's mitzvahs in a physical way, this is like God is hugging us, because there's an aspect of chesed to it, especially when we give tzedakah, which is considered like the highest form of a mitzvah, is giving tzedakah, doing good deeds, acts of charity, acts of loving kindness, and through that, and all of that. And now the Alter Rebbe here concludes, and he says that through attaining this aspect of focusing on the rachamim, on compassion, then we can actually come to the level of ava rabba, which is, we talked about, this is the great love. This is the highest form of love that we discussed earlier, and it can become revealed in a person's heart. As is written, Yaakov asher pada et Avraham. So this is a verse from Yeshayahu, chapter 29, verse 22, where it says that Yaakov redeemed Avraham. And so what does this mean, that Yaakov redeemed Avraham? So Avraham is considered the attribute of chesed, and of loving kindness and love. And Yaakov, as we've been discussing today, is the attribute of compassion. So even though we've been focusing today about this attribute of compassion as an alternate form of serving God that really has nothing to do with love and fear. So it's not that it actually has nothing to do with it. It actually has a lot to do with love and fear of God. But not only that, it actually can lead to love, because compassion itself can lead to redeeming love. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this is explained elsewhere at length. So that's the end of the section. And so just to recap, so today, the subject of today was really all about compassion, and really all about how compassion can be a really great way to connect to God and to serve God. And this is really illustrated in the story of Yaakov kissing Rochel, because when Yaakov kissed Rochel, this wasn't just like a interesting romantic story that is just like placed in the Bible kind of haphazardly, but there was a lot of spiritual things going on, because Rochel is the Knesset Yisrael, the collectivity of the Jewish souls. Yaakov is the attribute of compassion. And so when he saw her, first of all, he lifted up his voice on high. So he tapped into his source. He tapped into the source of compassion on high. And then he drew down from there through his crying. He drew it down into this world, and then he kissed Rochel to make a real connection, so that this attribute of compassion would now be associated with the Jewish people. And then what does this mean? This sounds really esoteric maybe, and kind of like very abstract, though it is a very beautiful story. What does this mean to us practically is that through arousing this attribute of compassion within ourselves, and we can really think about the fact that it is something to be compassionate about, that our soul, our godly soul, that has that spark of godliness in it, that spark of godliness came down through a really big journey that's like really depressing for it. It's really not meant to be here. This state of exile is not the proper home for our godly souls, for that spark of godliness here. So that's something that we really want to feel compassion over, and we want God to feel compassionate about it. And then in order to connect our compassion with God's compassion, is we do his will, right? And when we do his will, we can do that through using the 3 different garments of our soul. We can use the garment of thought, speech, and action. So when we connect our thoughts and our speech to God's thoughts and speech, so when we think about Torah, when we speak about Torah, then that actually is like us kissing God, the way that Yaakov kissed Rochel. And when we actually do physical mitzvahs, especially the mitzvahs involving tzedakah and chesed, which are really the ultimate mitzvahs that we want to do, this is like hugging God, and this is like accepting a hug from God, because we know that the attribute of chesed is very much associated with the right side and with hugging. So that is it for today, and we will move on to chapter 46 tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.